The overconfidence that many of us have when we put ourselves or walk a mile in other people's shoes or assume that we understand them actually flies in the face of that true connection. It's a false sense of connection. It's a false sense almost of superiority, that this other person can't possibly understand me. I'm too complex. I'm too subtle. There's too much going on inside me. But that other person, they're easy to understand.
We're just projecting. You're projecting the postage stamp understanding you have on an enormous world and universe within somebody else and going, well, of course I get it.
I would go as far as to say it's a soft form of dehumanization.
Welcome back, everybody. I'm your host, Greg McKeown, and I'm here with somebody I've invited very particularly with intention, a godfather of modern empathy, someone who in rapid speed has gone deeper and more precise about empathy, about connection, what connects us, why we can't connect anymore, what we can do to connect better. He also is a professor of psychology at Stanford University. He directs the Stanford Social Neuroscience Laboratory. So whereas maybe the rest of us are guessing at what works and what doesn't in interaction with people, in relationships, Professor Zaki's out there really trying to get it precise so that we can learn, let's say on the cheap, how to avoid some of the blunders that we unintentionally make in our insecure overachiever ways. He spent his career in that world, but puts out there that he also has a past life as a frustrated novelist. But before all of that has, let's say, he uses the term an empathy gym to describe his parents' divorce and how that became fodder for developing this competence, this skill, and for, so far, his life's work. With that, Jamil, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Greg. It's a pleasure to be with you.
I want to put a premise to you and then just go from there. The idea that we have lost a technology. And I don't just mean empathy, which of course is not nothing, but something even more precise within that. 1952, Carl Rogers, in some ways the most influential psychotherapist, in my estimation anyway, of the 20th century, not someone well known today, is invited to speak about communication at an event. He writes an article, Communication, its blocking and facilitation. And he describes a process that he has found to be superbly helpful in bringing together people who are completely polarized and within a very short period of time leave feeling mutual understanding and even respect. He's clearly thrilled about the finding. He describes it as a test tube solution. Says, throws down a gauntlet. Let's study it. Let's refine it. Let's scale it. He envisions even international relations utilizing, he doesn't say technology, I'm saying that, a technology that they're just putting together, just discovering. 75 years later, where do we stand? There's hundreds of articles that have been written and almost all corroborating Rogers' findings in his therapy work. But here's the thing, and this breeds into a couple of questions for you, but I can't find a single article, not even one peer-reviewed academic article specifically testing the Rogerian system that he discovered and put in place. Not one. I can find things that are peripherally related and many, many things that are sort of related, but the actual challenge he laid down, I cannot find anyone who has picked it up. And as an unlikely candidate as I am, I feel this the personal pull, the call from the deep to try and do some of that work. Well, that's the premise. Just what's your reaction?
Wow. What a wind-up, Greg.
Needed to wind it up, didn't I?
I don't know many people who know anything about Carl Rogers, let alone know as much as you appear to about his system, which we could think of as radical empathy, the willingness, and you perhaps know it even better than I do, but my fuzzy understanding from graduate school recollections is that Rogers believed in the transformative power of listening actively, but doing so from a place of fundamental respect. The idea that another person's reality is simply as valid and complex and beautiful and difficult as your own, granting them exactly as much humanity as you grant yourself, and then placing that value, that intention into an active listening practice. As you say, Rogers was very influential in the world of psychotherapy. As you also say, I'd argue that he has been not influential enough in the behavioral sciences in our attempt to actually understand what works. And here, there's a huge disconnect between the ways that we study human beings and the ways that human beings actually work. You know, Greg, I think it's really quite insightful and evocative the way that you're using the term technology here. If I'm not mistaken, you're saying that we have at our disposal natural technologies, human abilities that when systematized can bring us together in new and powerful and productive ways. But we also have other technologies, the scientific method, for instance, or brain imaging, the study of the body's physiology and biology. And what you see, at least from my corner of the world, is that the study of empathy has really bifurcated. On the one hand, you have therapists like Rogers who use it and know what it's like to actually connect with people for a living. And on the other side, you have scientists who want to understand the mechanics of human empathy the way that you understand the mechanics of the physical heart or of the brain or of a car or a computer. And in order to do that, we try our best to dice up this process by using very simplified experiments that are nothing like real conversation. And so we end up creating laboratory models of the thing that by their very nature destroy the thing we are attempting to understand. Now, I do want to give some credit to my friends who do this work, and I suppose to myself as well, that in the last 10 years, there has been a circling back where scientists are using very sophisticated and, to my mind, really revolutionary technologies to go back to not just study how do people respond to pictures of somebody else who seems like they're in pain, which is maybe you could call that empathy, but has nothing to do with the deep Rogerian version, and to actually start studying people again in natural contexts. So, for instance, there's this really thriving, brand new neuroscience of conversation, where scientists are actually having people interact with each other while either wearing portable devices that can understand what's happening in their brain, or by looking carefully at their biology before and after those conversations and using that to understand what happens during the conversation or how those conversations literally rewire our bodies. So I think that there's a circling back to Rogerian style paradigms in science, but I would say that the provocative way that you set us up as having lost a technology has to do with the fact that scientists are so, and again, I'm talking about my own kind here, but we can get so obsessed with the shiny new technology that we have scientifically that we lose sight of the human technologies that have been there all along.
So much that's interesting in what you just said. Let's just build a little more on the lost technology idea to build our conversation. I mean, just level setting. I think most people, including Silicon Valley itself and the leaders and engineers within Silicon Valley, seem to have an assumption, which is once you discover something, it's banked. We have it. Now we use it to make progress. And of course, that is what happens much of the time. But there's many, many examples of technologies, literal technologies that, competencies that we once developed and then lost entirely. And I mean, an example of that at first I didn't believe. I had to sort of do the deep dive to be sure that this was true. But so, we put a man on the moon and then repeated it 5 more times in the next few years, and then not since then. And then, as it stands today, not a single country in the world has the full competence to be able to put a person on the moon. In fact, NASA, when they decided to try to resurrect this, the old system, the old knowledge, found that while they did have the blueprints and they had various portions of the competence, they needed to go back and interview the original engineers who were still alive to be able to bridge the gap in their own understanding. So the blueprints, of course, it's not the full competence. These are fragments of knowledge, and so we can fully lose technology and ability. My observation isn't really aimed at scientists within empathy, or I really liked your answer. It's just, there was this breakthrough, there was this promise, there was a possibility, and that has not been distributed, it has not been developed, it has not been studied. And as far as I can tell, and I've been searching pretty seriously, I want you to contradict me if I'm wrong. If you say, oh, there is an article and here it is, I want it. Okay, now, what's the technology? Now, there's many pieces to it, but one of the insights, and you use the term radical empathy, and it was the rule that you only get to make your point after you've made the other person's point to their satisfaction.
Mm-hmm.
Now, that idea of a two-way listening, more than listening test, two-way naming of meaning is, I think, the most important single element that needs to be studied. And understood, so that somebody who's never even heard it before, who's never even really has no sense of it, could actually start to experience it and it be developed. So now my question to you is, when you say there are these neuroscience conversations taking place, study the biology before, or are actually monitoring the brain activity while it's going on over this last 10 years, which is, could you envision doing such a thing with the Rogerian, two-way listening test? Could you imagine doing that? Do you know of anyone who has? Could it be done?
I think absolutely it could be done. Has it been done? No, I would say not in the world of neuroscience, at least. That said, there's a whole bunch of research on the right ways to provide, the most productive ways to provide support to others. There's both research within the world of psychotherapy, clinical research, and there's a fair amount of research in the context of marital conversations. There's a science of close relationships that focuses on, well, let's say that a couple is in conflict. Let's say that one of them needs support. What works? And by works, I mean something very specific. What makes the person who needs help feel as though they're better off afterwards, and makes them feel closer to the person who has tried to help them.
Mm-hmm.
Or in the case of a conflict, what allows two people to de-escalate that conflict, not merely by walking away, but rather by feeling that they have found some common ground. And in those spaces, you can see glimmers of what you're talking about as this Rogerian paradigm, which is sometimes in psychology called perspective getting.
Yeah.
So this is a cousin.
Yeah. Versus perspective, is it perspective taking? Remind me the language that he's contrasting it to. Perspective getting versus perspective guessing? Taking, just perspective taking. Yeah,
that's right. I mean, so I teach people empathy all around the world, lots and lots of different contexts, lots of different groups, from CEOs to middle schoolers. And one of the first things I do is I ask people, what do you think empathy is? Greg, do you have any guesses as to, there's one answer that far and away exceeds all the others in popularity. Do you have a guess as to what that might be?
I wish I knew the answer to that. Now, I wish I had it. I mean, I suppose maybe people would say, maybe they'd say it's sympathy. Maybe they'd say it's being nice, it's caring. Maybe they'd say it's love. Maybe it's walking in somebody else's shoes.
There you go. You go. You've arrived at it. You've arrived.
I expanded to 100 different answers until one of them was correct. I increased my probability of being less wrong. Yeah, go on.
All of the nominations you gave are probably in the top 20, top 25, but there's a power law distribution, and by far the most popular response is walking a mile in somebody else's shoes.
Right.
And I think this gets to another reason that the technology, the Rogerian technology you're describing, hasn't been taken up, because I think we have a fundamental cultural misunderstanding of what empathy is. Walking a mile in somebody else's shoes is in essence looking at another person's situation and asking yourself, how would I feel if I was in that situation? It's our default in our culture. And we think that through this process, we will somehow be able to read the mind of another person because we assume that they are like we are.
Yeah. It's very egocentric empathy, attempted empathy.
It's egocentric, I would say, in two ways. One is it's the assumption that you are similar to another person or they are similar to you. So I can use myself as a template for understanding you. The other way I'd say it's egocentric, which is the second way I'd say it's egocentric, which I think is sneakier, is it's the underlying this view of empathy is the idea that it's sort of a personal skill, that the empathic person won't ask any questions. They'll just have all the answers. They're basically clairvoyant because all they need to do is sit in their armchair and pretend they're walking a mile in your shoes, and they'll just, like that, understand exactly what's happening inside you.
Yes, and I'm sure there's more that you want to help me understand about this, but I don't want to miss this idea because if you use that as your working definition, then you can double down on one of from my point of view, in my research, one of the primary blockers of understanding. Okay, I'm like interrupting you, but I don't want to miss the thread and come back to it. But I want to share something because I think you'll find it interesting and it will help us develop this conversation. So, of course, you are familiar, even if those that are listening or watching this aren't familiar, with the Tapper game, 1990. Newton, I can't remember the first name suddenly, Elizabeth Newton maybe, writes a dissertation at Stanford. And in it, one of the studies she conducts is a very simple study. She says, okay, we have 80 people, 40 people are tappers, 40 people are listeners, and the tappers are assigned to select from 25 songs, one that is, they're all really easy. They're the most obvious songs in the world, that everybody knows them. And they have to choose a song, and they're going to tap it to to this other person, could be a stranger, could be man, woman, it's just randomly assigned, and they have to guess what the song is. Before they do that, she asked the tappers their confidence level, and overall found that their confidence level was 50%.
Mm-hmm.
So I know I'm preaching to the choir with you right now. In reality, it was 2.5%, so only 3 out of the 120 tries that they conducted did somebody catch the song. Now, here's what she didn't do, which I think is really interesting, and so I'm replicating the study in order to ask this question, which is, what was the confidence of the listeners?
Mm-hmm.
So I just did this with a team. It wasn't in a scientific setting, but found that the confidence of the listeners was much higher even than the tappers, which really surprised me. So they thought, before they actually did the exercise, they were even more confident that they would be able to interpret it, which to me, now this is all back full circle to the point that you're making, is if you are overconfident, if you walk through the world thinking, I already get you. The problem is you don't get me, but I already understand you. That bias, the definition that people are offering, and this is, of course, the point, is not helpful to that. Because you can sit there going, oh, what would I feel? I know exactly what that person would be going through, and exactly what they feel, and exactly how they see it. And you're doubling down on an assumption that's actually wrong. Anyway, I wanted to share that. Please continue.
I love that. And, the Tapper study, and I agree, it would have, there's a lot more that could be done with it, but it's an example of something really profound, a profound mistake that I think we make. So, Greg, it will come as no surprise to you that I think one of the most powerful and compelling and beautiful things about our species is how deeply connected we are, right? I mean, the way that every interaction between people is physical in a way, right? The conversation that we're having right now, we are actively rewiring each other's brains. We are physically changing the nature of each other's bodies by interacting.
I love that.
And I think it's really something that makes our species work. But I think that the overconfidence in the Tapper study, and the overconfidence that many of us have when we put ourselves or walk a mile in other people's shoes or assume that we understand them, actually flies in the face of that true connection. It's a false sense of connection. It's a false sense almost of superiority, that this other person can't possibly understand me. I'm too complex. I'm too subtle. There's too much going on inside me. But that other person, they're easy to understand. It's a way of
Which is projecting. You're projecting the postage stamp understanding you have on an enormous world and universe within somebody else, and going, well, of course I get it. Carry on.
I would go as far as to say it's a soft form of dehumanization. Not the dehumanization of hatred, but the dehumanization of reducing somebody to something that you think you already understood, when in fact that person is just as complicated as you are.
Do you know C. Terry Warner? Is that a name you know? It was a philosopher for like 50 years. He wrote really heavy, I would say pretty heavy academic articles. Wrote a book called Bonds That Make Us Free, which is also not especially well known, but has really been a life-changing book for me. And one of the ideas that at least is attributed to him is that this idea: to an immature person, other people are not real. And that seems to be what you're saying. It's not that you're not quite you're not describing the sort of dehumanization of the Nazi, Germany, enslavement camps, right? Like you're not saying a sort of active anti-empathy. You're saying just the presumption. It's like the presumption makes us dumb, makes us emotionally unintelligent.
Absolutely.
Go ahead.
And it's. Yeah, I think it is almost solipsistic when you think about it. But really, I think also there's a nervousness underlying this. There's a sense that I'm supposed to get people. And so if I don't get them, there's something wrong with me. And so even if I'm confused, I better pretend, and I better just
Yes.
do what I can from my, again, from my armchair to understand this person and then project confidence. It's a very individualistic approach to empathy, which is fundamentally non-individualistic. And
Mm,
I think that the Rogerian technology requires something that is very difficult for a lot of people, and maybe that's
mm,
why it hasn't been taken up, especially in
mm.
international relations.
Sure.
It requires humility.
Mm,
It requires us to celebrate all we don't know about other
mm,
people, and not
mm.
just to feel humble, but to communicate that humility through this process of, as you said it with Carl Rogers, before I can make my point, let me do my best to say what I think you are saying, and then to request your help in understanding you, to turn this from an individual skill of me being so great at understanding you to a collaboration between us. And I think a lot of people are just scared to engage in that type of collaboration. They're scared that it will signal that they're not smart enough, or that they're not empathic enough. And they're scared that the other person will think, well, why don't you already know what is going on in my head or in my heart? When the truth is that perspective getting exercise is much more connective and much more powerful, both in fostering understanding between people and in building rapport and trust between them as well.
Before we move from perspective getting as a subject, there's sort of an assumption so far in what that is. So it's got kind of a very specific idea to it, that you're not taking the perspective. You're not sitting there guessing. By getting, it means you ask people. So the metaphor is used by the researchers that I understand coined the terms. They say, well, think about the Christmas gift, the birthday gift challenge, when you're trying to guess or take the perspective of the other person. You're buying the gift, and you put lots of effort into it. You can spend lots of money on it, and then it could be a really disappointing experience. It could
Mhm.
actually be a withdrawal from the relationship, even though all you're doing is trying to invest in it. So it could be an anti investment, and they, as I understand, actually tested, right? It's Epley, I think,
Yep.
and it says, okay, well, just ask them. So, like, if you actually want to know the best gift to get somebody, you literally ask them, and you find exactly the gift, the color, the place, the thing, and that's what you buy. And of course, surprise goes down, but satisfaction goes way up. And whether it's literally true with the applying it with gifts, you're saying this is what you have to do. If you want to understand, you have to ask. You have to go and get the perspective from their point of view, not read your perspective into theirs. What did I get wrong?
Exactly. Exactly. No, that's exactly right. And again, I think that we often fear asking because it shows that we don't know, and we think that it's our job to know already. But the data are quite clear on this. So Nick Epley has work on this, as you're saying, where asking leads to much more positive outcomes than trying your best to work it out in your head. My late friend Emile Bruneau did work on this, where he found that when people engaged in this pretty Rogerian perspective getting across cultural difference, for instance, white U.S. Americans and Mexican immigrants, for instance, that this helped those groups of people connect more effectively and feel that they had greater common ground. There's a whole bunch of cases in which this type of perspective getting, humbly asking people what they think, what they feel, what they need, or what they want, is simply more effective. And, Greg, I can imagine listeners saying, well, duh. So that perspective getting maybe seems obvious. Oh, you're just telling me to ask people what they feel? That's like the simplest thing in the world. But oftentimes, I teach this to people. I teach them I ask them to have conversations with each other where they share something that's been meaningful in their life in the last month. And while their partner shares, I say, I want you to do two things. First, try perspective taking, because perspective taking isn't just something that we do in our minds. We also do it in conversation. I'm sure that you've experienced this, Greg. Sometimes you share something that's going on with you, and somebody's way of trying to relate to you or respond is to talk about a similar experience that they've had. right? So you say, "Oh, it was a tough weekend. My kid was down with the flu," and they say, "Oh, my kid had strep throat last month." And it's a
Reading their autobiography into the other person's experience
exactly.
instead of just learning what their experience is.
Exactly, exactly. And look, I don't blame people for doing that. I don't think it's a mean thing to do. You're trying to relate to the other person and make them feel as though their experience is normal. That's a well-intentioned move conversationally, but as you said, you were just inserting yourself into it. And so I ask people, do that first while your partner talks. Do that for a few minutes, and then I want you to switch modes and go into perspective getting. And after they do this,
By
people
which you mean specifically, I mean, of course, I gave my own understanding of Nick Epley's work, but what do you assign them to do?
yeah, I say, I want you to paraphrase what this person has told you and then ask whatever follow-up questions you have. Clarify with them, ask them what you're missing, ask them to fill in the gaps of your summary.
Paraphrase and ask.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
And afterwards, people are frankly embarrassed because they see how instinctive perspective taking is for them. They see that the first half of the conversation sounds like most conversations they've had in their life.
That's awfully good. Yeah,
and,
carry
and
on.
then and then they see that the second half of the conversation is extraordinarily effective in actually making the other person feel heard, in actually learning about them. And as
Mm,
you said, they realize that there's this technology, if you will, of
mm,
just asking questions that
mm,
has been available to them their whole life,
mm.
but that they typically have elided in favor of just talking about themselves.
There's a lot to unpack there. What do you find is the best way to help people wake up to the problem and the solution? Maybe that's the case. Maybe that's the exercise you're just describing. Maybe that's what it is. Have you found any other ways to be able to make this, I would say, invisible and often intangible subject concrete for people and relevant?
Yes, yes, I have. And I'll say that for me, there are a few things that you need to change a habit, right? I mean, first, you need an awakening experience where you see the way that the habit is maybe not getting you where you want to go, even if it's gotten you to where you are right now. And so for me, in my workshops and in teaching people, that's the moment that I try to give them, a moment of awareness, a moment that something needs to change. Unfreezing is what Kurt Lewin would call it, right? And then you want
And is
to
that
create.
using that exercise? Is that
Yes,
your go-to exercise? Is there another you found that works as well? Or you're like, no, that already works. This already does the unfreezing.
I mean, I honestly can't imagine an exercise working better.
Yes,
Of
got
all the
it.
exercises that I
Got
give
it.
people, this is probably
Got it.
one of the most effective.
Yeah.
But then I think there's a way that you can do that. You can systematize that type of curiosity without me teaching you, right? And one way to do that, there was a great article in Harvard Business Review about this a couple of weeks ago from Jeff Wetzler, where he basically asks people to audit their own curiosity before a conversation. And he's talking about this in terms of workplace conversations, but you can imagine doing this in any conversation. If you know you're going to talk with somebody, I would say write down all of the things that you know you don't know about them, their situation, their needs, and figure out what you want to learn. You know, I think that many of us in conversations, especially, our goal is to present ourselves, to impress the other person, to get some idea across, to, like the movie Inception, to take something that's in our mind and inject it into theirs forcibly or otherwise.
Yep.
And what
Yep.
I think you can accomplish by using this humility prompt instead is to change your goal from a performance goal to a learning goal, and to maybe change the tone of the conversation from a debate or, some type of comparison of two people to feel more like an interview, one where you are really, through your questions, trying to accomplish what you want, which is to know this person better, as opposed to impress them or get them to think some way about you.
Mm. Satya Nadella would, I think coined it, but it certainly popularized it, the idea of the difference between being a know-it-all and a learn-it-all. And that seems consistent with what you're describing there. But there was something else. Let me see if I can just remember it here. What were you just saying?
Just about shifting our tactics in conversation.
Oh, that's right.
Yeah.
So that made me think of Richard Feynman's technique for learning any subject. So if I'm remembering it right, the order of operations is 1, you write down whatever the subject matter is in the center, there's the name, and then sort of creating like a map from it, a web, everything else you know. And you do this in, like, let's say you're doing this in a black pen, and you just everything you know and how it's connected. So you empty your knowledge on that subject. And then you go and study it, and as you're learning things, you add those connections of that information in blue so that you can see the progress that you've made. But that seems to me to be really aligned with what you're describing, that a person could use the Feynman technique to build on this HBR article of deliberate humility, like the name of the person, everything you know, and then you see all the things you don't know. Okay, that's everything else. And then after the conversation, hey, how can I fill this in? How can I actually see how much I was able to gain in how short a period of time? I kind of like that.
I love that. Yeah, it's like building a circuit diagram of another human being with their desires, their fears, their personality, their worldview. And I think any of us who tried to do that with most people in our lives would be maybe shocked at how sparse those diagrams are. And we could be intentional about filling them in. I think that Satya's approach to being a learn-it-all is great. And I think that people, including in Silicon Valley and in tech, have a weird dual response to that, right? I think that many people, especially in technical fields, now I think embrace humility and a growth mindset around those technical skills. It's great. We celebrate failure, fail to learn. And we love to explore all the things that we don't know. And I think that humility serves people really well, like it did Feynman in building expertise around technical subjects. I think that we are much worse at applying that same humility to our relationships and to our connections with other people. And I think a lot of the time people know that mathematics is something that they were not born understanding, that particle or quantum physics is not something that they are born understanding, and therefore they know that they want to learn it. But a lot of us think that we are supposed to already understand how to interact with each other. And again, I feel like it can be embarrassing to acknowledge that you don't know how to talk to a person in a way. Obviously, we all know how to talk with each other, but you don't know how to apply the best technologies that we have, the psychological technologies that we have to those conversations.
Yeah, there was a video that I'd found, and I was trying to talk to my children about it because I thought some of it was relevant, and I got the title wrong, and the title I gave it was intelligent, like highly intelligent, emotionally immature people. And that isn't actually the title of it, but that named what he then went on to talk about. He identifies, I think, 6 things that people often do and get wrong with each other, and reacting and jumping in and all these things, and he does it really well. But that idea of being highly intelligent but emotionally immature does sort of name a kind of problem that I think maybe all of us have experienced at one time or another. People in that field. What's your reaction?
I think that's a really powerful description. The only, I suppose, pushback that I would have to it is that oftentimes people use language like that, highly intelligent, emotionally immature, to describe a person at a trait-like level, that this person is that way, and
Fixed, the
yes,
fixed view.
and they always will be that way. Whereas the data from my lab and many others are quite clear that, in fact, these are also skills, just like mathematics, just like chess, just like basketball, that
Learnable.
that are learnable. And so I would say that yes, you can call somebody emotionally immature the same way that you could call them jump shot immature. Like, yes, like Greg, I'm a basketball fan. I'm one of the worst basketball players you've ever seen. If I take 50 jump shots right now, I'd probably miss 45 of them. And that's from the free throw line, not even a 3-pointer. But that doesn't mean that I'm jump shot immature in any trait like way. I could, a year from now, probably make 40 of those 50 if I just practiced. And so I don't want the language of immaturity to be used to reify or stigmatize people, or to be used by them to let themselves off the hook. Because I've also seen that, especially with leaders. I often work with leaders who tell me, wow, I understand the power of empathy, but I'm just not good at it.
Yeah.
And I say, well, that you're going way too easy on yourself. You wouldn't say, I'm just not good enough at investor relations, or at raising funds for my startup. You need to be good at that, so you need to work at it, and you know that. But you might not know that you also need to work at empathy in order to accomplish what you want in your life.
Mm-hmm. There's a Pride and Prejudice scene that's coming to mind now from the book, where Mr. Darcy and Elizabeth Bennet, in this the quintessential, well, what would you say, couple of misunderstanding, right? Like really seriously missing each other, and at least in Elizabeth's case, absolutely sure she sees him right and understands his type from almost the first moment. And there's an interaction that she's been told off because by Catherine de Bourgh for not being great at piano. You need to practice. You need to do that. And then later, almost right after that conversation, Mr. Darcy is saying, "Well, I'm just not easy with people. I'm not good with strangers. I'm not good with breaking through." And she says, with correctly and with no empathy, well, I think you should take advice of your aunt and practice. That's what you need to do. And so it's kind of this cutting but truthful interaction that they're having. It seems consistent with what you're saying. Like this is learnable, and we have a responsibility to upgrade our human skills.
I think we have that responsibility to the people in our lives, but it's also worth noting that this is a responsibility to ourselves. One of the greatest sources of fulfillment, meaning, purpose, and happiness in life is the ability to feel connected with people we care about and to serve them. And to the extent that you work on your empathy, to the extent that you work on these technologies, you will serve a better role in other people's lives. You'll be more effective in helping them. But you have to remember that this will also probably circle back and help you as an individual feel really a great level of fulfillment and well-being.
With this leadership team I was with, I posed a question I'd not posed this way before. And it was, going back to the Tapper game idea, what would happen if we went through life assuming that other people understand us, or worse, assuming that we understand other people, let's say at even the 50% level, that we are that confident, or maybe it's higher, as I found in this small data pool, 80%, I think on average 82% was the number, confident that they would understand somebody else's tapping. What's the consequence of that level of confidence if in reality you were 2.5% good at it? Right? Like, so you're actually terrible at something you think you're really good at, and that thing is understanding other people. What would the consequence be? And this feeds in, I think, to what you were just saying about the, in a sense, the self-interested reasons and advantages to developing these skills. And one of the first answers that the member gave was, well, if we had that confidence in reality, gap, then we'd be wrong a lot. And then somebody else said, well, we'd be really bad at decisions because we'd think we had, we'd be making decisions based on faulty data. And then somebody else said, we'd be wrong and we'd think we were right. And it was like, yeah, okay, that's the worst possible scenario. I think Margaret Thatcher had an idea about this, or a quote that's been popularized, that the people who, like the leaders who don't know but think they know, are the most dangerous people to have in charge. And that's true at any kind of leadership, self-leadership, relationship, family, team, organization, business, school, anything. And so, I just sort of sharing that to support the case you're making there, that there is considerable tangible benefit to really being able to understand people faster, better, cutting through the noise, cutting through your own assumptions, their noise, their masks, their pretense, which of course is also going on, also adding to the difficulty of the task. You're dealing with rubbish data, faulty data, wrong. You're wrong. You're going to be wrong. That's the thing. In fact, for a while, I thought about this work and this research and these ideas as all around the single phrase, like less wrong. Is how can you be less wrong? It's not even how to be right. It's just be less wrong with people, incrementally, and you could make an enormous amount of progress by just a continual pursuit of being less wrong about people.
I think that's right, and the confident wrongness is, as you say, the most dangerous, and sadly, perspective taking makes us more confident. I mean, Nick Epley did a bunch of studies where he asked people to either just make guesses about others. So, for instance, what music do you think this stranger likes? What percentage of Americans do you think agree with all of these different statements, et cetera, et cetera? Some people he just asked them to guess. Other people he asked them to first think about what they like or what they think, and to project basically themselves, to engage in perspective taking. And he found that people who engaged in perspective taking, their accuracy didn't move at all from just a random guess, but their confidence increased, because there is this sense that
you've gone through a process.
Exactly. If I have put effort into this task, so that effort must have paid off somehow. And really, if what you're saying is correct, and I think it is, that the true mistakes, that not just errors, but the consequential mistakes in our life that actually create damage are not just about being wrong, but about the delta, the discrepancy between how wrong we are and how wrong we think we are, then a process that doesn't make you more accurate but makes you more confident is net negative.
Yeah, it's a bit of a disaster, that, isn't it? Because as you say, you go, well, I've paid a price. And I've done this so many times, I'm guilty of this all the time, of creating a story that makes sense from the data that I have. And in some sense, in some situations anyway, it's like that's all you've got. You can't always go and get data from the person. Like, it isn't, depending on the subject of the situation. Nevertheless, the difference between that and gaining any information at all from the source is just amazing to me. I'm thinking here of Quibi. Do you remember Quibi? The whole story of Quibi. Almost nobody does. Like, when I ask that, almost nobody does. But I love that you do, and that'll be a Silicon Valley Stanford connection. There's I'm thinking $1.4 billion of funding raised. Yeah, so that's like an enormous amount of capital. My goodness, you've got Katzenberg, you've got remind me from eBay and then HP, Meg Whitman. And
Mhm.
I'm not trying to call them out at all in saying this. They're competent people. They're capable people. You know, they have reputations and experience. And I don't think the failure of Quibi is a story of, oh, they're just foolish. It's a story about how really smart, capable people can get it completely wrong because of perspective, perspective taking,
Taking.
where you're just imagine what the customer wants, and we'll just think about this over here, and we won't actually engage enough to figure out, is that real? Do people really have, for example, the example they use? So this was a Quibi stood for quick bites of video of TV, a kind of curated YouTube
Mhm.
service that you'd be paying for monthly. And the use case was, imagine you're standing in line at the grocery store and you pull out your phone to watch the next 10-minute segment of this show, this high quality show that's been done. And the rise and fall of Quibi is one of the most striking stories of my lifetime. That I think they closed down 9 months after they launched. I mean, it's done. 1.2 billion was spent, and you're just done within a year. And maybe that was the responsible thing to do at that point. I'm not saying that was even the error. But the risk of thinking and telling people, and then you got 1.4 billion to be able to insist that your way is the way of the future. This is how it's going to be. I thought it was a sort of chilling example for all of us to go and actually find out, to go and actually understand, not even be understanding. Not be more sympathetic, not be more patient. Go understand, go ask the questions, go really listen, go see it from their point of view, go see their life and how important that is to be in the wild. Yeah.
I think it's a really powerful example. And yes, I do remember that crash and burn. And it's a story of overconfidence, but I think it also drives home a point, which is that you shouldn't ask a question unless you're ready to deal with the answer. And I think that a lot of the time, the reason that people don't engage in perspective getting is because truly there are answers that they can't accept. The folks who were working on Quibi, let's say that they had only gotten their first 300 million of investments, and they did test it out. And people said, actually, what I want is peer-to-peer video. I want it, in other words, TikTok, instead of a curated show that has actors that I know and is delivered in 6-minute intervals. Like, that's not appealing to me. Well, if that's the data that they had gotten back from their perspective getting, they would have had to close up shop. They had a lot of commitments to a particular answer. And that, I think, is another barrier to the Rogerian technology, right? It's not just our lack of humility. It's not just that we think we're already supposed to know the answer. It's that there are certain answers that scare us and would require us to rethink our first principles. And sometimes the commitments that we have to those principles are financial, and sometimes the commitments that we have to those principles are ideological. I mean, one example of this is the vast and incredibly mistaken assumptions that people have about folks who they disagree with politically, right? There's now dozens of studies of political misperceptions that find that if you are on one side of an issue and you're asked to think about the average person on the other side of that issue, you're wrong in basically every way that we social scientists can measure. And not only are you wrong, you're hostile to people correcting your information, because in essence, you're ideologically committed to a view of the other side as dangerous or stupid or violent or whatever you want to believe about them. And so I think that there are many cases in which it's not just our lack of humility, but it's the commitments that we've already made that really require us or make us feel psychologically compelled to avoid asking the right questions.
I'm so glad that you brought us back to the other side. Humility is one piece, but even back in the 1952 article from Rogers, one of the things he said, if you try this rule, he says, you'll think it sounds so simple. You think, how hard can it be? He said, if you try to do it, you'll find it's one of the hardest things you've ever done in your life. He said, for one of the reasons is it takes courage, and we don't always have it.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I have just been really reminded of this recently, because I sat to facilitate between two members of a family, not my own family, but two people who I knew were who were in a complete communication breakdown. Not a husband and wife. I'm just not wanting to say too much beyond it for their privacy. Nevertheless, one of the individuals had, here's how it normally goes. I'm facilitating a conversation either with one person on their own or with two people, and I'm trying to apply this technology, and I'm trying to understand and cut through as fast as possible, still humanly and humanely, but to the real issue, to what's the pain point, what's the pinch point, what's the stuck point. And so we're doing that, and we get very quickly into the sort of the general area of pain. But I always, though, now anyway, yeah, that's also, now we found the pain point, but now we have to expand that into gigantically, because all the complexities inside of there. And so I'm trying to do that, and I the whole time I'm now looking for a frame, the meaning frames that they each have adopted at some deep level that they don't even know they have, that makes communicating almost impossible. Because there's some meaning that's deep enough down that's just, as you use the term, first principles, like self-selected first principles. We found, at least for one of them, we found it, and it was a very specific idea, right? It was, in my experience is that frozen meaning frames are made up of two pieces, like magnets connecting together. One thing that's true, that's real, and one piece that's not real. And they get fused together, and then that's the trap of it, because the true part keeps your loyalty, your sense of, like, I die for this because this really matters, but you're trapped now because it's attached to a position or another part of understanding that's completely not true. And so you're trapped by the thing that isn't true, but you feel loyal to the truth. Well, we found it, and I was like, this is a breakthrough. We have it, and I've seen that before, and it's kind of a magical moment. It's like, that's it. That's what it is. That's why you can't work. That's why you can't communicate, because this is what it's about for you. Yes, but then, to my surprise, they just doubled down on it. It was so, to me anyway, self-evidently a false connection. Lots of good connected with something that clearly wasn't true. Self-evidently not true. And I'm not giving up in this sense. It's not like I say, this can't be done now. I think what follows would be a session to be able to to disconnect that further, to give them a chance to really on their own to work through how was that formed and what does it mean and so on. There's like a deeper process. But my experience before this is typically people, once they see it, they're like, oh my goodness, now I can be free of this. And the amount of the courage, it's like this. Yes, this takes courage because let's say this person has gone through their whole life actually genuinely, completely believing that the way they see things is actually the way they are. Right? Like, yes, I can learn bits and pieces extra, but the basic way I see it is true. So then if somebody has a fundamentally different way of seeing it, the risk that they are grappling with, this is literally true in this instance, is a sense that if I change this, if I unlock this at all, I will lose everything. I will lose like my mind. I will lose reality. I will lose truth. It is literally as strong as that for them. That's the words, that's the language. And I really, I would say, learn, I think something that's much more common than just that person and just this situation, that this is really what's at stake for many people. Yeah. Reactions, thoughts.
Well, I think that I think that there are two levels of courage required to really listen. And I think that that's because there are two levels of risk. The level that you're describing is what I would think of as somewhere between epistemic and existential, right?
Literally,
That,
in this case. Yep. Carry on.
that
Yeah.
I have my version of reality and I need to trust it. That's the source of all of my stability, the stability of my sense of self and of my belief that the world is somehow in my control. So it's one of my greatest personal commitments. My late colleague Lee Ross would say that the need that we have for certainty drives us to what he would call naive realism. This sense that whatever my version of the world is just the world. It's not my version of anything. It's just accurate. And therefore, whenever somebody
I'm
has
still
a different...
so guilty of that. I'm still so guilty of that.
We all are. We all are. And therefore, if somebody else has a different perspective, my job is not to figure out who's right in what ways. My job is to figure out why they're wrong and how I can disabuse them of their incorrect notions. And the courage then is to say, well, through dialogue, I can be changed. I'm willing to be changed. This is also what the marriage scientist John Gottman says is critically important to productive disagreements between couples is, will you allow yourself to be moved, not emotionally, but mentally by the other person? And so I think that's risk number one. But there's a second risk, Greg, that you're not focused on because I think the context that you were helping with is different than the context that I think a lot of disagreement happens in. But there's a second level of risk I think weighs very heavily for many people, which is a social identity risk. So let's say now that it's not just two people arguing about a personal matter, but rather two people arguing about an ideological matter. Well, now you are
as it
not
was in this case.
Oh, okay. Well, there you go.
But please continue.
Well, now you're not just you, the individual who needs a stable sense of reality. You are an avatar, a representative, an ambassador of your community, of your group. And if you show humility, if you ask too many questions, if you seem like you're movable, well, then suddenly you're not a stable member of the group. Maybe you're not a reliable member of the group. Maybe you are a traitor. And it turns out that there actually are data that find that when people perceive a member of their own side as listening to somebody on the other side of a disagreement, they actually penalize that listener as being not as good a group member. I mean, I think you see this in language right now that I find personally irritating, the language of platforming. The idea that to allow somebody to express their perspective is somehow damaging, morally damaging or socially damaging. And look, I don't think that every perspective needs to be, I don't think that we need to relitigate old debates that have been solved, right? For instance, evolution is one that I'm pretty secure in, but that said, I would not say, oh, if you listen to somebody who doesn't believe in evolution, you're a bad member of the evolution community. I think this notion of, hey, we shouldn't platform people because it's too dangerous to listen and because listening is the same as betraying our own side. I think that speaks to another layer of risk that people perceive and another layer of courage that's required for the Rogerian approach.
Yeah, I mean, you're tapping into just one of many linguistic flourishes that have become more and more common in our hyper-polarized modern world. and I mean, I think it's all so dangerous. Like, I think it is. I would say everything that I've learned about these subjects is that it's. I don't know. Maybe I put it in. Certainly, I would put it in top 5 threats. To the Republic. Maybe I would put it even higher than that, because it's always the bottleneck, to everything else. If you can't understand each other, well, it's more than that, isn't it? It is not just you can't understand each other. There's a term that I coined. I don't know if it will catch on exactly, but it's disunderstanding rather than misunderstanding, because misunderstanding. Okay, well, I thought we were meeting at 8 o'clock in the morning, but it was 8 o'clock in the evening. I mean, that we use that word misunderstanding for so many things, as if that is in any way like the kind of dialogue. Well, you just can't even call it dialogue, but the kind of, the definition of disunderstanding is listening with the intent to misunderstand, right? Like to intentionally miss the meaning of the other. And if it ever happened that everybody in a society, community, family, anything fully fell into that, that's it. There is the rest is gone. There actually isn't a family. There isn't a relationship. There isn't a society. You can't do anything. And it's a sort of, I sometimes think about this as like the Babel effect, because, okay, so Hebrew Bible, Tower of Babel, building this, trying to work together to build this tower that's going to get to heaven, and then God comes down and says, okay, we're going to change all the languages, and that's the way it's taught in Sunday school and in Hebrew schools, and maybe that's what happened. But there's another interpretation, right? There's a psychological interpretation of that story that doesn't require that to be a sort of literal formation of 100 different dialects. Is because all you have to have is this understanding to take place. All you need is the channel to become infected between people. The ability to understand each other is now gone, and now you can't do anything else.
Yeah.
So it really is this, to me, this foundational. It already is one of the dysfunctions of our time. The question is, in a world that now we know 1 in 5 people in America will say that they have stopped speaking to a family member or close friend because of polarization. 1 in 5. Well, if it can be 1 in 5, it can be 1 in 4, 1 in 3, 1 in 2. If it's 1 in 2, it's over, man. Like that's that. And nothing else. We can have the most incredible set of talent, resources, everything. We can be the Quibi of a society, but you're still, with the talent and intelligence and brilliance and work and money and every asset you could want, and you still make it worse if disunderstanding becomes the norm. Am I exaggerating?
It is becoming a norm, and I agree with you. I think it's from my perspective a top 3 threat to our culture and our society. I laugh not because it's funny at heart, but because the way that you describe it is so spot on. One of my favorite studies on this subject was carried out in 2016, just after the presidential election in the U.S., and researchers used geo-tracking on people's cell phones to see where they went for Thanksgiving dinner, and where they lived. And what they measured was whether people crossed party lines. Did they live in a Democratic county and had dinner in a Republican county, or vice versa? Or did the geo-tracking suggest that they were dining with like-minded people? And what they found, if I recall, was that when people crossed party lines, and this is controlling for the distance that they traveled for, and many other factors, but when they crossed party lines for dinner, they left on average 56 minutes earlier. They left Thanksgiving dinner. And
no, that's a great finding. That's a great little study there. Yeah, go on.
And Greg, the last 56 minutes of Thanksgiving dinner in my 40 some years of experience is when you have pie, which is talk about existential. That is the reason for Thanksgiving dinner. So people are forsaking sugar in order to avoid conversation. And I think that this speaks to the rise of disunderstanding. And I love the term. To me, I agree with you.
You picked up this term. You just
Yeah.
picked it up. You validated it. Now it's real. Go on, carry on.
Well, because it's not dialogue; it's dueling monologues that people have, and you see this. There's this very popular, I don't know, YouTube channel that I really dislike, called Jubilee. I don't know, Greg, if you've ever
Is this the
heard...
25 people around an expert and you have to come in there and so on? Right. I know what you're talking about. Yeah, go ahead.
And so, it's just built for sound bites. It's, the conversations are an hour long, but they're really just created so that you can put things on, TikTok and Instagram that are 60 seconds long of somebody owning somebody else, scoring points on somebody else, humiliating somebody else for being ignorant. And when
that's another one of those flourishes, isn't it? Owned. We have so much of that in the clickbait now. Owned. So-and-so owns this person. Great. I can watch that and I'll feel validated in my view. Terrific. Carry on.
And when you see that type of dialogue, and when young people especially internalize that as that's what it means to disagree, well, what do we expect them to feel when somebody disagrees with them? I mean, this is a threatening public context where you are being evaluated for your morality and your intelligence. It's not at all a place to learn. It's not a place where asking questions is safe in the least. It's a place where the only safe harbor for your identity, both as an individual and as a member of your group, is disunderstanding. It's the only safe thing you can do, is to come up with the best point you can and just keep it in the chamber and unload it whenever the other person stops talking.
It's gladiatorial.
It's gladiatorial conversation. And it's so destructive and corrosive to the fabric of our culture, and I might add, to our psychological well-being, right? It's so the ambient levels of cortisol that you deal with when you think that this is what conversation is must be so much greater than if you actually think of conversation as a collaboration. So that's all. I mean, this is all the terrible news, but I do want to leave us with a little bit of good news, which is that I think all of this is vastly unpopular. I don't think that people want this. I think that people have become convinced that this is what we want because of what the great journalist Amanda Ripley calls conflict entrepreneurs. To me, the people behind the Jubilee account, many social
polarization profiteers.
Polarization profiteers, right? And so disunderstanding, I would say, is not just something that crops up in us. I mean, I think it's something that maybe the average person resorts to when they feel unsafe. But I don't think it's most people's preference. But it is a growth industry. And when I say industry, I mean
completely agree.
In a very specific way, in that people are profiting off of generating disunderstanding.
Yes.
They're profiting off of presenting people with this loathsome image of folks who are different from themselves and disincentivizing open conversation. And, not to be conspiratorial at all, but one of the things that can make a population easiest to control is if they don't trust each other. And so if conflict entrepreneurs, polarization profiteers, they don't just earn money by sowing disunderstanding. They also make
power
people,
too.
They sow power. Yeah. And I think that this is really something that most people despise. I'll just give you one example. I want to hear your reactions to all this, but my colleagues and I ran a study at Stanford. This was with a large class of about 500 students. And we asked them, how do you feel about having, and Stanford, of course, is a pretty liberal place.
Yep.
So generally speaking, the most controversial speakers will be right-wing speakers.
Yeah.
And you may know that at some colleges, these speakers, their events are canceled or protested.
Thrown out. Yep.
And
back to your point about platformed.
Exactly.
Yep.
So we asked students, how would you feel about a right-wing speaker coming to campus? And how accepting of that would you be from one, they should not be allowed to come on campus, to 7, I'm totally open to them being here on campus. And then we asked the students, not just for their own opinion, we asked, well, what do you think the average person in this room would say to that same question? So we have a closed system. We're asking people for inferences about a group of people where we have 100% ground truth data on them, right?
It's a census.
So, exactly. And what we found, and what we found is that the average student was a 5 on a 7-point scale, pretty accepting
Themselves.
of difference. But they thought that the average member of their class, so the true average was 5. The imagined average was 2 on a 7-point scale.
Yeah, that's an amazing result. It's such a concrete, helpful study to do, to be able to illustrate this problem of being sold a story about each other. Because then the person still has a sense of what they themselves think, but they are interacting with each other not only in a person-to-person way, as has been the case for like almost all of human history, right? Like the people that you're with, you can only interact with them or not. And then suddenly, because of the rise of social media, you are able to interact with people in a completely different way. And I mean, I'm just with you so much about the engineered nature of this. And I'm not a conspiracy theorist at all. If someone is highly strategic and determined, at some point it crosses close to the word conspiracy, right? They're conspiring to do a thing. And, a modern term for that is strategy. And I'm not anti-strategy, obviously, but the idea that there aren't people strategically, intentionally trying to get a result that they want and not worrying so much about the externalities of that is completely clear. And in Silicon Valley, I've worked for 15 years with every major company and lots of the minor companies and startups, is often guilty of drinking the Kool-Aid, of their own product. And in a sense, that's inescapable in one sense, because you have to be willing to sacrifice and work and go after it to be successful. So it's an inherent bias, but it's really real. And the idea that like social media, all technology is founded on assumptions. And if you don't examine the assumptions, if you can't see them because you're just breathing it in, or everyone seems to be breathing it in, or it's invisible because the founders used that algorithm at the very beginning, or they had assumptions themselves, it's extreme. Then it's not, I don't just say dangerous, it's extremely predictable that the technology itself will automate the assumptions that have long since been forgotten. So, and I'm not out to get people in naming high profile technologists in this conversation. It's just maybe part of it just is what it is, I suppose. Zuckerberg recently interviewed, sort of poses his own question in the interview and then answers it himself. He says, well, people ask me, will AI friends replace real friends? And he said, well, the data today is that that individuals in America want about 15 close friends. That's the market. And right now they have about 3. And so I don't think that AI friends will replace real friends. I think that it will just meet the unmet demand. And I thought this was like, if you looked up the word chutzpah in the dictionary, like you would see Mark Zuckerberg in this moment on that definition page. Because for a person to say, who promised the world, something like 20 years ago, 1,000 friends, to then be publicly stating that actually the number is now 3, and so that the data is strong and clear, especially with men, but over women over a longer period of time, the number of close friends is nosedived over that same 20-year period, particularly for men. It's just incredible to me. I'm like, I kind of trust I cannot trust this. The incentive is so powerful for him to want the world to embrace AI friends because, that's the company I just built. I've risked it all again on this company now, on an artificial world and world creation. And I'm like, man, none of that's neutral. It is, and that's just one example of others that are in the same category, I think, as you're saying. Go ahead.
And we don't need neutrality, right? I mean, some would argue that neutrality is impossible. I think that, if you have drunk the Kool-Aid and what you're committed to is the iPhone, great. If it's Quibi, not so great. But even worse is if it's something that could really do harm. And this is a whole other conversation, and maybe we can have another conversation on it. But just briefly, I think the idea of AI friends is so interesting. One is the reason for that is that AI actually, there's a whole group of studies that have come out about in the last year or so, is shockingly good at making people feel heard because AI has actually adopted some Rogerian technology.
Yeah,
right?
really.
More, and the data are clear. More than human interlocutors, AI companions will paraphrase and then ask for clarification.
Yeah,
They actually
that is actually absolutely true. I don't want to interrupt it. Just one tiny data point to add to that hill of data that you're describing. A few weeks ago, I just put it on LinkedIn, so non-scientific, but a couple of thousand people responded. Okay, who's the best at understanding you and listening to you? Family, friends, colleagues, AI, 50% or above AI was the answer. Okay, that's today's version. And that doesn't mean I think that other people, it's not saying that AI actually is that great at it. It just is saying it's better at it than the humans in my life. And carry on with the point you were going to make.
Which I think is a really powerful data point. I mean, there's a bunch that I would say to that. One is, I think that those studies are suffer from a little bit of Pepsi challenge
like
short-sightedness. Do you remember the Pepsi challenge?
I do, yeah.
Craig?
But tell us why you're saying it at this point.
Yeah,
just Pepsi, Coke, covered up, but go ahead.
Yep. So just for folks who don't know, this is a campaign a long time ago where, basically consumers were asked to drink 1 ounce of Pepsi and 1 ounce of Coke. And the vast majority, I think it was 80-something%, preferred 1 ounce of Pepsi. And Pepsi turned this into massive viral ad campaigns.
Absolutely.
The folks at Coca-Cola panicked, and they created New Coke, which was even greater disaster. It was the Quibi of colas, really.
It was the Quibi of colas, my man.
And it turned out that there's a clear reason for this, that Pepsi has more sugar in it. So if you have 1 ounce of Pepsi, you like it more than 1 ounce of Coca-Cola. But if you try to drink a whole can, it's cloying and borderline disgusting, and you don't. Well, I mean,
that's great.
It's just, and to me, this is a real limitation of AI empathy, because the studies that show that people think AI is listening to them a lot more are based on single shot interactions where you say one thing and AI responds. I don't know, Greg, how much you interact with any AI agents about emotional topics. I do, partially because it's fun and partially as field work. And I find that it is very quickly obvious that these agents are just using a rote sort of recipe, and the novelty and the compelling nature of it kind of drops away after a while. Now, I'm not saying that's everybody's experience, but I think it's important to watch out for Pepsi challenge mirages in these data. But the second thing,
counterfeit understanding, counterfeit connection, counterfeit empathy.
Yeah,
I want to explore that more. Go ahead. I don't want to miss your second point.
Well, I do want to make another point though, which is that there's a separate danger to the AI friend, utopia that Mark Zuckerberg outlines, which is that it's great to feel heard. That's a fundamental human need. And if AI agents fulfill that, especially for people who are not experiencing it with the carbon-based life forms that they know, that's great. That's I think can be helpful. The problem is that AI friends don't then require you to understand them, to do any work, and they also can't give you feedback if you're not doing that work. They can't leave you on red and not return your calls. They can't tell you that you've done a bad job or at least they won't tell you that you've done a bad job interacting with them. They're just less challenging. And, I think that, of course, being understood is a fundamental human need, but so is acts of service, including listening and being there for other people. And if you turn friendship into a consumer product, and really have an agent who is less like a friend and more like a servant, an emotional servant, you corrode the reality of what friendship is supposed to be in the first place.
Yeah. So let's talk about, like, we can combine, I think, this bad news and good news into a single kind of single frame, which is like the marketplace of empathy, the economy of empathy, or the marketplace of understanding, where you say, okay, well, what do we know about the demand? Okay, cradle to grave, really deep, persistent, produces primal panic when we really feel unheard, or especially if we're harshly judged. That's serious. It also has, also within demand, if you are understood and you are connecting and you can understand others, I mean, that's really, there's a lot of benefit that comes to. So the demand is enormous. Okay, so now you look at the supply side of it and you say, okay, well, what is our level of supply? And you say, well, for all the reasons we've discussed here and other contributing factors too, it's low. Most people haven't been taught how to understand and deeply listen and empathize and so on. Now you're out there doing doing the Lord's work, right? Like, you're out there trying to figure it out and teach people and so on. And there's the number of people who have had developmental experiences with this is really low. Then you've got all these forces we've just been describing. So for all these reasons, you have low supply. Now, what's the consequence of that? Well, to me, the consequence is the following. The bad news first, then the good news. The bad news is that whenever you see in a market high demand, low supply, you find the creation of a luxury market. I guess I've started with the good news now, in a sense, the luxury market. So and we're seeing this, I think, with human connection. So one has to have a certain level of status to be able to talk to a human at an airline now. And you can pay for an executive assistant, or you can pay for a coach. And so there's like a luxury market there. And the good news in that, I'm not saying that's all good news, but the good news in that is that if a person can produce high quality, precision understanding of others, then their value can be enormously high. That's the benefit, right? The person listening to this is one primary driver to develop this competence. Now, the bad news part is the second market that gets produced in any market like this is you get the counterfeit market, you get the black market, right? So that's why you have all the handbags and all the watches and all of this. You have it, and to me, the AI friends is something like that counterfeit black market, and that's I think the warning. This isn't the real thing. This is there's a word I'm looking for. I can't quite find it, but this is the what is that, like metallic? I'm looking. It's almost, the word is almost like metallic, but it's but anyway, that's what I think we're having. It's a total counterfeit. Your thoughts?
I would describe them as empty calories, right? That you have a need, you feel hungry for something, you consume it, you feel less hungry, but you haven't actually consumed too many nutrients, right? You haven't actually nourished yourself, and I think that this is one version of AI empathy. I do think there's another, and I think that there's a really powerful way that these tools could be used to make us better at connecting with each other. I mean, if they were willing to be more challenging, right? I mean, you could imagine not just having AI be the empathizer, but having AI agents play the role of the empathizee, and having these platforms be a training ground for low stakes practice in better listening, right? I think that if people were willing to use them more like gyms and less like lounge, right, like conversational gyms and less like conversational spa days, it would be good. It could be quite useful, because I think a lot of the times, as we're saying, the courage that Rogers said true listening requires is because there's a real downside if you screw it up. But if you screw up your listening with a virtual agent, there's
no risk.
virtually no risk. So it's the lack of risk could be a real strength of these platforms if we used it to strengthen ourselves. But if we use it to turn interaction into a consumer product, then I think there's a huge amount of danger.
There's a use case. I haven't tested it yet in any formal way, but I think it could be very interesting research to do, where you conduct a kind of Rogerian listening study, and the experimental group is using AI as the neutral facilitator. So that you give it its role, be the expert, be Carl Rogers, this is what I want you to do. And so the person is speaking into that. Rogers is then, the artificial Rogers is restating, and the other person can still say, well, no, that isn't what I mean, or yes, that is what I mean. And so you're taking its competence, but you're using it to aid human understanding, not to replace it. That I think is the big, the big thing. And that, yeah, this is.
I mean, it could be a very new technology that helps us strengthen a very old technology.
Yeah, I love that. I love that. Well, to scale it, like figuring it out clearly is one thing, but to scale it is a huge challenge. And I do think a kind of a translator app, where you're like, okay, we can't seem to figure this out, but why don't you say what you're saying right into that? There's some funny moves, there's funny bits on YouTube of like translators around this, and there's one famously pretending to be Michelle and Barack Obama, and it's by Peele and what's his name,
Key and Peele.
Key and Peele, and I mean they're just laughing about it all, but it is an interesting idea to be able to say, hey, here is a translator, here is actually a pretty neutral translator, to try and to see if this could interpret those words better, someone that's is neutral, and I think this could be, well, we'd have to find out. It has to be studied, but I think it could be a very helpful tool in scaling what is a very specialist skill right now in the world. Well, what an amazing conversation. Absolutely delighted. So much we could continue to talk about, but this has been really rich for me. There's only so many people in the world that one can talk about certain subjects in a certain way and at a certain depth, and you are one of those people. And so I appreciate so much you coming on the show. Why don't you give us any final words?
Oh, well, thanks, Greg. I think this has been very powerful. And, this is something that I don't get to talk about very often. And the way that you're framing this as a lost technology is really powerful. My only last reflection is that it's lost, but it's not lost forever. It's something that we can easily recoup. And I think its secret popularity is a force in our favor if we want to do that. I think it's really critical to remember that, you asked earlier, what is the result of losing this technology, of losing the technology of understanding? And I think we see it every time we go online. We see it every time we read the news. We see it every time we look at our culture today. But I think that the temptation is to say the ways that our culture is broken right now represent a fundamental brokenness of humanity or of our human capabilities, as opposed to they represent a historical accident, that things in a different system with a different history could be very different. The way that we relate could be different. In fact, the way that people relate in different parts of the world is quite distinct, right? I mean, collectivistic cultures versus individualistic ones have totally different norms around conversation. So I think it's just important to remember that the
We can rebuild it.
Yes, the rampant misunderstanding that surrounds us is not fundamental to who we are. It is a feature of our circumstances, and we are the ones with the power to change those circumstances.
I love that hopeful note, and I love it. For everybody listening or watching this, what is one thing that stood out to you today? Not even what you heard just from our words, but what did you hear inside of you? Like what resonated? What's the news for you? What is one thing you can do differently as a result of this? I mean, in the next conversation, in the next unit of your life, certainly today, what can you do differently? What is a tiny step that you can take, or a bold step, one that you can do now? And finally, who is someone you can share this with now that this conversation has come to a close? Thank you. Really, thank you for listening.